Hey guys, Walls here, and this presentation is about how to read a poem for English class. Basically, it's going to cover tips and tricks to aid in reading and comprehension of poetry. Let's get started here. Come on, clicker. There we go. So first things first, what's a poem? And this is from dictionary.com. Check out this definition. It's very fancy. A poem is a composition in verse, especially one that is characterized by a highly developed artistic form and by the use of heightened language and rhythm to express an intensely imaginative interpretation of the subject. That's all. It's very fancy stuff. So generally, here's what I think of when I think of poetry. And I got this quote from a guy named Benjamin. He works with an organization called Southern Word, and he's come into my classroom before to teach us about how to write poetry and creative writing in general. And this is what he said about poetry. He said, "The language we give you is not enough to describe the experiences the world will throw at you." So basically, poetry then is a way that we can use language, the same language we use to describe a lot of other stuff and to talk to our friends with and all that kind of stuff. We can use that same language to express feelings and ideas that are really hard to pin down. Or we can take commonplace everyday ideas and describe them in ways that are unique and individual and special. So let's just take a look at some of the ways or some of the tools that poets use to complete this objective. First, when we talk about our definition here, I do want to focus on these elements of poetry: verse, artistic form, heightened language and rhythm, and imaginative interpretation. So let's talk about verse first. Verse has to do with poetic structure. And in a poem, you're going to have lines of poetry organized by stanza. And it's important to note that those lines do not have to be complete sentences. You may have poems with lines that stop in the middle of a sentence. And when you're reading those poems, it's important to pay attention to punctuation. If you get to the end of a line of a poem and there's no comma or period, that means you're not supposed to stop, just like a regular sentence. It means you keep on going. It's really easy when we read poetry out loud to kind of pause at the end of every line. You're not necessarily supposed to do that. Now, so you've got these lines, and those lines are organized into stanzas. And stanzas are groups of lines that form units. And those units are separated by a single space. So a unit basically just refers to a group of lines it's a stanza, but they kind of maybe have the same idea. The main idea is the same. So think of it like paragraphing in essay writing. You know, an essay is built with paragraphs, and each individual paragraph may have its own main idea, but that main idea ties back to the overall theme or topic of the essay. The same thing goes with lines and stanzas of poems. Lines build stanzas, stanzas build poems, and everything works together to form the overall meaning. Another thing to talk about when we're talking about poetic structure is rhythm and rhyme. A rhyme scheme is just a pattern formed by end sounds. So if you're ever faced with a poem and the teacher goes, "Hey, what's the rhyme scheme of this poem?" You're just going to look at the end of each line and you're going to identify each unique sound with a letter. And I've got an example here. It goes A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And that's kind of a basic Shakespearean sonnet breakdown of a rhyme scheme. And what that means is in each stanza, the first and third lines rhyme and the second and fourth lines rhyme. And those rhymes are grouped in, they're four, they're quatrains. So A, B, A, B works together, C, D, C, D works together, E, F, E, F works together. And those last two lines, that G, G, that's just a couplet. It's kind of its own little thing, and it's got its own little rhyme scheme there. And so to get that, I would just look at the end of each line. Now, rhythm is a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. All speech, all writing has rhythm. But when you organize that rhythm, when you make it into a specific, regular, predictable pattern, that becomes meter. One of the most common meters is iambic pentameter. Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter all the time, and we'll get more into that when we start dealing with Shakespeare. Now, let's talk about poetic language. That includes stuff like figures of speech. You got similes, metaphors, personification. Those are the big three. And all those are kind of lumped into the category of comparisons. Whether I'm talking about a simile, metaphor, or personification, I'm comparing one thing to something that I usually think of as completely different, but I'm trying to show a relationship there to better or to help the reader better understand my point. So I'm going to take two things that aren't usually associated with one another, show how they're alike, and that'll help my reader understand the point I'm trying to get at. Another part of poetic language is imagery. Imagery is just when you use descriptive language that appeals to the senses. So anytime I'm reading a poem and I'm seeing something or I'm reading something that helps me see what the poet is talking about, that's imagery. It could be appealing to my sense of taste, my sense of smell, my vision, hearing, all that kind of stuff. And it could also just help me just build a better picture in my mind of the content of the poem. So there are types of poems that have none of this stuff. They don't have rhythm. They don't have rhyme. They're not written in verse. They don't have a clear pattern to their stanzas. And those are called free form. So a free form poem might be, it might have 3 stanzas, but the first stanza is 30 lines, and the second stanza is 2 lines, and the third stanza is 15. There's no real clear cut pattern or anything to it. So anytime you're identifying a poem and you get to the end of these steps I'm about to go over, and you're like, man, this poem's got none of that stuff, it's probably free form. So what are those steps? Every time we read a poem in this class, when you get a poem, the first thing you're going to do is just read the poem. I would hate to think that we get into a situation where you start immediately trying to analyze poems for meaning. Poems are meant to be experienced first and foremost, cold. Just read the poem. See if you can feel what the author wants you to feel, if you can see what the author wants you to see. And if you get to the end of the poem and you're thinking, I got nothing on this, I don't know what's going on, then let's go through these steps. So the first thing we're going to do after we read the poem is count the lines and stanzas. We're going to see if is there a pattern. Are there 3 stanzas and each stanza has 8 lines and that kind of stuff. We're just going to look for any patterns we see with lines and stanzas. Then we're going to look for rhyme scheme. And we're going to notate that on the poem itself. We're going to give each unique end rhyme or end sound its own letter. Then we're going to look for any lines or ideas that are repeated. When you repeat lines, think about your favorite song, the chorus, the refrain. Those are those are the lines that the artist wants you to kind of remember, right? Very few people, get the verses of a song stuck in their head. So maybe the poem has a refrain, or maybe there's 1 or 2 lines that are repeated throughout the poem. Maybe there are ideas that are repeated. Maybe certain concepts or symbols or objects it could work. Or just maybe one word. Think of "if" by Rudyard Kipling. The word "if" is repeated in that poem 12 times. After you've looked for that, look for examples of figurative language. Identify the personification, the metaphors, the similes. See if you can begin to wrap your head around the comparisons the author is trying to make. Then you look for examples of imagery. Where is the language in the poem that appeals to the senses? Maybe there is none, but try to find it. Then, after you've looked for and identified those elements of the poem, summarize the main point of each stanza. You could do that in the margins. Just kind of break down what each stanza is about. And then once you start adding those stanzas together, it'll give you a clearer picture of the poem's overall meaning. So here's how I'm going to check and make sure you paid attention to this video. I want to see some notes. Make sure you have identified the major terms in this presentation. But more than that, I want to see this. Get out your poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling, and tell me, is it written in verse or is it free form? And you have to explain. Go over this presentation again. I want to see specific language in your explanation that tells me you understand why the poem or whether or not the poem is written in verse or not. Tell me why it is or isn't in verse. Tell me what doesn't make it free form or what does make it free form. So that's how I'm going to check and make sure you watched this video. Come to me tomorrow, prepared to tell me with it written down, if is free form or written in verse. Hope you guys have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow.